Hello, this is Basar. In this tutorial, I'm going to show how we can handle the exceptions in Spring Boot. In the descriptions, you will find a link for this GitHub repository, and we have a project here created for this tutorial, and there are two branches in it. The main one is the initial step of the project, and the final one is the content that we are going to build in this tutorial. So let's clone the project. Here I'm running git clone. So the project is cloned and I'm opening this directory with Visual Studio Code. Now let's check the POM.xml. Here this is running Spring Boot version 2.3.4 and I'm running Java 11 and we have dependencies of JPA, web, and we have in-memory database H2, and we have this validation dependency, and that's it. And in the project there are already two packages, user and article, and there are entities like this article. We have the article which is having just the ID and the content, and the user having the ID, username, email, password. But the controller or service classes are not implemented yet, and we will implement in this tutorial. So let's start with the first case. Let's say we have a REST controller here, and we are going to send a GET request, GET mapping for this URL, users, and this user ID. Let's say user 1, user 2, user 3. And when we don't have any user in database, we will be returning an error response back. So let's implement the method. So it's going to be returning, let's say, the user object. And let's say this is get user, and we will get the ID for this method with this pet variable, and the user ID is the type for the user ID is long, and we are going to delegate this operation to user service. So let's inject it first. We have auto-wired user service variable here, and we are going to return this user service. We'll have a method of, let's say, get user by ID, and we will pass the ID we are receiving in the request. Let's create this method by using the editor assistance. So in user service we have this method, but first let's make sure we add the annotation of service to the user service, and we will use the user repository, which is for the database related operations. So we are going to auto-wire it here, auto-wired user repository, and we are going to return the result coming from this user repository find by ID. This method is returning back an optional, and we must be checking if the optional contains the data in it. But for now, let's say we will just call get, and if there is no value, it's going to be triggering this exception, no such element exception. So this is the implementation. Now let's save all these changes and let's run our application. So the application is running. Now I'm going to send a GET request to this endpoint with Postman. So switching to Postman here, our endpoint is localhost 8080 users, and let's say user 1. Sending the request. And here we are receiving this response, having this timestamp, status, error, trace, the trace containing all the exception details, and the other parts like the message and the path. So by default, Spring is generating this error response, but we can override this one. First, let's add a new package under this root directory. Let's call it error, and adding our custom error object. Let's call it API error. And in this error object, we will have the fields, let's say the status, the message, and it will have the timestamp in milliseconds format, and we will have the path. And let's add the constructor, and this will have, let's say we will initialize our API error object with the status, the message, and let's say we will pass the path. And here let's assign them right here in this constructor. This message is going to be the message, this path is the path, and we can initialize the timestamp by new date. This is going to be a date object, and we can get time in milliseconds with this getTime method. And let's add the setters and getters for each of these fields. Set status, get status, set message, get message, set path, get path, set timestamp, and get timestamp. So our API error object is ready. Now we are going to use this in our response. So what we can do here is, instead of returning this immediately, we can just wrap this part with a try catch, and let's do that here. So whenever an exception is thrown, let's say this is going to be catching all the exceptions. Now we can return whatever we want here. But first, let's update the method signature. We are saying that we are returning the user object, but now we have two options. Either the success case, where the user is in database, we will be returning it back. But otherwise, we are going to return the API error. So let's change this user to response entity, and as a body type, this is requiring the type to be defined. Since this is a generic, we will just set this one as question mark, because it can be either user or any other object. So let's change this part also. We are going to return a response entity, and it is going to be a success response, and the body of this response is this user service get by ID result. And if there is a failure, we are going to create an API error. Let's say error, and this is a new API error. Our status is, this is a user not found case, so we are going to return HTTP status of 404. And the message, let's say user not found, and the path is the users and the ID. And then we can return response entity, and we will set the status as 404 not found, and the body will be this error. So let's save all these changes, and the application is restarted. So going back to Postman and sending same request, and here we see the API error response in the actual response body. Now we have a solution, but this one does not actually using any Spring Boot functionality. So let's do the same thing by using the exception related assistance from Spring Boot. So if we just check the previous logs, here it was throwing this exception, which is this one, no such element exception. So instead of handling this exception object creation part right here in this controller method, in this catch block, we can create another method here, and we can ask Spring to call this method whenever this no such element exception is triggered right here in this user controller. So to tell Spring that, we are going to use an annotation of ExceptionHandler, and to this annotation we are going to pass the actual exception class, which is no such element exception, and we are going to implement the method here. It's going to be returning back the error, API error object, and this is going to be handling this no such element exception. And as a parameter, we can tell Spring to provide us the actual exception object. So let's copy it from here. Let's say this is exception. And in this method, we are going to create this API error instance, and we are going to return it. But first, we have to update a couple of parts here. So in this one, we are setting our status code, user not found the message, and we have this path, but we cannot get the path from exception. But we can tell Spring to provide us the HTTP servlet request, and from that request we can get the actual request path by get servlet path. Now we can just revert the actual get mapping handler back to where it was. It was returning back the user, and here we were just calling this user service get user by ID method. So we are ready, saving this one. So the application is restarted, and again testing with Postman, sending our request, and here we see the same response back, but there is a difference here. Now we are receiving this response body, but the actual HTTP status code is 200 OK, which is wrong. So here at this exception handler, we can tell Spring that we want the response status to be HTTP status not found. Saving this one more time. And the application is restarted and sending the request. And here we are receiving the 404 not found. So we are able to map the no such element exception to our response body. We could achieve the same thing by creating our own custom exception. So let's try that. Let's add a new class right under the error package. Let's call it not found exception. And this is going to be an exception which is extending runtime exception. And let's also have a constructor not found exception, which is taking the parameter of message. The runtime exception has a couple of constructors, and we want this not found exception to be initialized with a message value with it. So we call super message, and we have this warning. It is asking for serial ID, serial version ID. So let's do the suggestion. Now, in the user service, this get method was triggering this no such element exception, but now we can just throw our own custom exception by using this find by ID was returning optional, and we will use optionals, the function of or else throw. And here we are going to implement a lambda function for supplier, and this is going to be returning back new not found exception. And let's say the message will be user does not exist. So we are going to try this one, but we need to update the user controller first. This was looking for the no such element exception, but now we can replace it with not found exception, and we can get the exception here. And instead of setting the API error message like this, we can get the message from the exception instance like this, exception get message. So we are going to get the message which is set by our constructor, the constructor parameter. We set the message as this one, and in the actual API error object we are using the message coming with the exception. So let's try this one. And here we see we are receiving the message we are looking for. By the way, this naming must also be updated. Let's say handle not found exception. We have another package here for article, and it has this entity, article entity, and we have the article controller, and we have the article service. Let's implement the same functionality for this article not found case. So we will start with the article controller. It's going to be REST controller, and we will be having a get handler here, get mapping for, let's say, articles, and again we will get the ID of article to query it, and we are going to return back the article. Let's say this is get article method and path variable long ID. Again, this is article ID is the type of the ID is long, so we expect to receive a number for this path variable, and we are going to delegate this operation again to article service, and we will be returning article service get article by ID method. This method does not exist, so let's create it. Again, this is going to be a service, and we are going to get the articles from database through article repository. Let's auto wire it, and again we are going to return our custom exception if the article does not exist, so the implementation will be almost similar. Let's copy this whole line and paste here. We were running the find by ID of user repository, but we are going to run this time for article repository, and it is going to be throwing this not found exception. Let's import this exception first, and let's change the message as, let's say, article does not exist. So let's save all these changes, and let's send a request to this endpoint. So our request will go to articles 1. And here we see it is not returning our object, the API error. And here we see we are throwing our not found exception. Article does not exist, but the response JSON is not what we are looking for. Because this exception handler, we defined it here in the user controller. So this is working if a request goes to the endpoints defined here. For making it work for the article controller, all we need to do is just copy this part and paste here. Saving this. And sending the request again. And here we see the API error response. Now, instead of handling this exception both in the article controller and user controller, we have another option, like adding a specific class, which is taking a role in Spring, and it will be handling this exception handler cases in it. So let's create that one. Again, in the error package creating, let's say error advice. And for this class, we are going to use another annotation, which is REST controller advice. And we can move this implementation of exception handler into this one. And we can just remove the implementation from user controller and article controller and just go with the error advice having this implementation only. So let's save all these changes. The application is restarted, going back to Postman, sending request, and here we see the API error. And if we go to users, again, we see the same API error object in the response. Now let's add another exception case. Let's add validation to our implementation. Let's say we have this user object and this username cannot be null. So using the not null annotation coming with the Java validation constraints. And we are going to add a new endpoint to user controller. We are going to send post request, so we will have post mapping, and we are going to post users. So let's say this is going to be returning back the user object saved to database. And let's say this is create user, and we are going to get the incoming user object from request body, and it is going to be the user object. And again, we are going to delegate this operation to user service, but first let's say this is going to be a valid request. So the Spring is going to be checking the validation. So if the user does not have the username, if the field is null, it is going to be throwing an exception about it. And let's implement the rest of the part. We are going to return the object saved to database, and the save operation will be handled here in the user service save method. The method does not exist yet. Let's create it. And here in the user service, we don't need to have a valid here. All we will do is just call user repository save method, and we will pass the user object coming in the request. And this is returning back the user object saved to the database, which means we will have user ID in the response. So we have completed our implementation. Let's save all these changes and let's try with Postman. So opening Postman. Now we are going to send a post request. Let's copy the path first here. And we are going to send a post request to this path. And let's create a body of let's say this is going to be a JSON, and let's say username will be null. Sending the request, and here we are receiving this 400 bad request, and here we see method argument not valid exception, and here in this response we also see which field is failing, and it is saying the username not null, constraint is applied, and the message is right here, it is saying must not be null, the field username must not be null. So we are going to overwrite the response generated for this method argument not valid exception. So what we will do is we will just go to our error advice and add a new exception handler for method argument not valid exception, and we are going to return API error, and let's say handle method arg not valid, and let's get the exception, and again the request, we will get the path from request, and let's just copy and paste the implementation from here. This time we are going to send the response status as 400, and also let's update this part. This is going to be response status http status bad request 400, and we get the message from exception, and that's it. Saving this one, and sending the request again, and here we see our API error object is sent back. But this implementation has a crucial missing part. In the previous one, the default error message generated by Spring was containing the actual field and the corresponding message about the validation failure. So it was saying the username cannot be null. Now let's enhance our API error object to contain that information too. So for that, we are going to add a new field, and it is going to be a new object inside this the main API error object. We will have validation errors, and it is going to be basically a map which is having a key and value. Key will be the field name, like the username, and the value will be the actual validation error message, like the must not be null. So let's do that. Opening the API error and adding a new field here. Let's say map string. This map has the key as string and the value as string. Let's say this is going to be validation errors, and this is going to be a hash map. And let's add a setter for this map, setter and getter, set validation errors and get validation errors. Now in the error advice, from this exception object we can get the actual field errors, and we can do it like this. Here we will get the binding result from this exception, get binding result, and this binding result has the field errors. Binding result get field errors. So this is a list of field error object. So we are going to loop in this array. So we will have a for loop here, and we will get field error. Let's say field error in this binding result get field errors. Let's import the field error, and in this field error object let's fix the typo here, field error object. We have the field name like this and corresponding error message from this one. So we are going to add each of these field names and the messages to a map. Let's create a map right here. Again, a map with key and values as string, and let's say validation errors so we will call validation errors maps put function, and as a key we will put the field error get field, and the value will be field error get default message. And then after the loop finishes, we will set the error object, the API error object's validation errors to this map we just created here. So saving all changes and sending our request once again. And here we have this validation errors, and it is saying the username must not be null. We can just go ahead and do the same implementation for the article. We can just add a validation for this content. Let's say this time we will use size constraint, and let's say it is going to be minimum 5 characters and the maximum 100 characters. And we will have a post mapping here for the article. Post mapping articles. Let's say save request body is an article object. Again, this is going to be a valid request, and we will delegate the save operation to article service save method, and let's create that method. Let's go to article service and let's run this article repository save with this article object. Now saving all these changes and going back to Postman and sending post request for articles endpoint. And this time we are going to provide the content, and this is going to be, let's say, just 1 character long. So this is an invalid request, so we will be receiving corresponding validation error message here in the response, sending the request now. And here we see the size must be between 5 and 100. So with this way, we are handling the errors, the validation errors, also in the same logic, and we use the same object, and we have a standard output when our application throws some errors. But there is one more issue here. So let's go back to one of our previous cases, like we will call get users 1, and this was throwing not found error, but now we have this validation errors object in it. So we can just remove this one out of our responses when it has nothing in it. So we can do it this way. Let's go to API error once again. Instead of initializing this validation errors immediately, let's leave it as null, and we can use the Jackson library, which is converting Java objects to JSONs, and we can use that library's functionality by adding the annotation of JSON include, and we will pass the parameter of JSON include non-null. So when Jackson is building JSON from this object, the JSON will be based on the fields which are not null. So in the error advice here, we are setting the validation errors only when we have validation errors exception, validation related exception. Otherwise, like this not found case, we are not setting the values for it. So the validation errors field in the API error will be null. Therefore, we don't expect it to be visible in the JSON response. So saving these changes once again and sending a request with Postman. And here we see validation errors are gone now. And when we post an invalid request, here we have the validation errors in the response. We have one final way to handle the errors. We gather all the exceptions into this error advice, but just like this one, we can create a new controller which will be mapping the errors to our custom error objects. Spring is internally forwarding the errors to an endpoint like this one, this /error, and this endpoint is being processed by a specific controller, which is basic error controller. So this controller is listening to the request coming to this error endpoint and converting those errors to the ones we have seen previously. So when we were not implementing this method not argument for the exception, let's comment this out and see the result. So opening the Postman once again and sending this request. So this JSON response is being generated by the basic error controller. Now we can just replace that one with our custom implementation. So let's do that. Let's add a new class here. Let's call it ErrorHandler. And this is going to be implementing an interface which is ErrorController. This ErrorController is having a method to be implemented here, this getErrorPath, but in fact this getErrorPath is being deprecated with the Spring version 2.3. So this path is by default the error, but if we type something here, it is not changing anything. If we say, let's say custom error, this will not be applied. And here we see in the explanation, this return value from this method is not used. If we want to change the internal error path, we can use this properties server error path, and then whenever an exception or any error occurs, Spring will be sending requests to that endpoint internally. So whatever we write here is fine, so leaving it null. Now we are going to handle the request coming to this error endpoint, so let's change this error handler to REST controller, and we are going to receive any message is sent to this endpoint. So we will add a request mapping. We don't care if it is get mapping, post mapping, or anything. We just want all requests to come to be handled in this endpoint. So we are using this request mapping, and we are looking for the messages redirect to this error. And in this controller, we are going to return API error back. Let's say handle error. And as a parameter, we need the actual request. So we ask Spring to provide us the web request. And in this object, we have the data we need, like all the error messages, the paths, the message, the status, or the validation errors. We have them here in this web request object. But to get the actual values from this web request, we need another dependency. So we are going to inject it to our error handler here, which is error attributes. So the error attributes is coming from not the reactive, but the servlet package. So error attributes here, Now we are going to get the errors by calling this error attributes get error attributes method. For this method we will pass the web request, and the second parameter is again this one is deprecated. So let's find the other one, the get error attributes, looking for the web request and the error attribute options. So we will create error attribute options, and we will use this factory method, and this is looking for which kind of attributes we are looking for, and we want to include the message, and we want it to include binding errors. And this is returning us a map like this, map string, and the value is object, let's say attributes. Now from these attributes in API error we need these values like the status, the message, the path. We can get the values like this. So first let's get the message. We get it from attributes get the message, but this is returning an object, so we cast it to string here. Then we are looking for the path, and we received from attributes get path. So you may be wondering where the attributes are listed. So if you go to error attributes, there's one implementation of it, this one, default error attributes, and in this class you can see the list of the attributes here. So we have path, message, status, timestamp. So that's how we can get each of these attributes. And the next one is the status. Again, we are going to cast the data from object to integer. So with these values we can create our API error object, new API error, by passing the status, the message, and the path, and we will return the error back. But there are some more things to do, like the validation case. We would be receiving the validations by first checking if this attributes contains key, if there is a data about, if there is anything related to errors. Again, the errors is part of this attributes keys, and as you can see here, it is there if there is a binding result exception, which is for validation case. So if we have errors, then we will get the errors. Let's call attributes get errors. This is going to be returning back. Let's go to this error advice. It is returning back the binding result get field errors part. So we are receiving list of field errors. So that's how we get the validation related errors. Here again it is showing this warning, so we fix it by casting, and it's now complaining since this is an object. We are just casting to specific object the field error without checking the type of it, so that's why it is complaining. We can just suppress this warning. So we can say suppress warnings by unchecked. So this is unchecked type, the casting. We are not checking if this is an instance of list of field error. So that's why it was showing a warning there. So then from these field errors, we can generate our the map here. So just copying this part from here and pasting right here. And instead of getting the field error from binding results, we already have them here, field errors. So here we are looping in these field errors and putting them one by one to these validation errors. Then we are setting it into our error object. Then we are returning it back. And now we don't need this error advice, and we can just comment this REST controller advice part, comment out this part, and let's save all these changes. So this was automatically restarting, but in some cases like this one, you may see failures like this. So just stopping the application and starting once again. So the application is running now, going to Postman, sending our request, and here we see our error object, and this is being generated by our new error handler here. Here we are converting the error attributes to our custom error object and returning back to user. So let's go to this use case. In this one, we were throwing the not found exception, and let's try to get the user. And here we see the error object, but there is a difference in this one. This time it is mapped to 500 because the not found exception is being converted right here this time, not in the error advice part. And in the error advice, we were specifically telling to Spring to return back the 404 not found. But now the request is being handled here, and we cannot tell the response status right here because this is returning the response for the validation errors, which is mapped to 400, and this is also returning back the errors for the not found case, which must be mapped to 404. To achieve that, we will be adding response status to this exception, and our status will be not found. So saving this one, testing it again, and here we see the 404 not found is being sent from backend this time. So we have a couple of alternatives to handle the exceptions, and this error handler in the end is the last one, which would be handling any error case which are not handled in any other places. So we no longer need this error advice, and all we need is just this error handler to map the errors to the ones we are looking for. So thanks for watching. That's all for the Spring exception handler cases, and hope to see you for the next tutorials.